I've already mentioned writing up, and I want to turn my attention now to this issue of how you write up and what it's about. The first thing is that writing up is an essential part of the research. Of course, you've got to do the research, you've got to go out and collect the data and so on and analyse it, etc. But at some stage, you have to write it up, either because you've got a degree to submit for, so you're doing a dissertation or a PhD or whatever, and you've got to submit the write-up because you won't get your degree otherwise. But even if that's not the case, then there is certainly a very strong ethical case for saying that you should write up. You've taken up people's time and effort, you've maybe been paid to do the research, but you've certainly taken up the time and energies of your respondents in the study, the people you've been studying. So you know, in some sense there is a kind of bargain going on here that, you know, I'll get paid to do this, I'll use your time up to do it and so on, and I'll give back the results of my research so you can see what's going on. So that's the kind of payback idea of writing up. Now, when you do that, when you write up, the important thing to think about here is the audience you're writing for. Now, of course, if you're writing up a dissertation, then it's going to be the examiners, you know, and the markers who are going to look at that dissertation primarily. Same with a PhD. But in other cases, other kinds of writing, the audience may be quite different. It might be a lay audience, a non-academic audience, and so on. And it may be different kinds of audience. You need to think clearly about who you're writing for and how you do that. So here's some examples. I've given a list here of different kinds of formats you might use. The one you're most familiar with would be the scientific journal format, not least because you've been reading scientific articles now, you've been reading journal articles and looking at them, so you know what they look like and you know how they're written, or begin to have an idea about how they're written and what kinds of styles they have. And as you do that, the more you read those, the better you'll get a judgment of doing it yourself. So when you write similar kinds of things, whether that's academic work for your degree or whether it's articles you might publish eventually, you've got a much better idea of how to do that. And I'll come back in a moment to talking about some of the formats for that. But don't forget there are other ways as well. I mean, the second one, the technical report, is it's very similar content in some ways to a journal article, but for a different audience. It's for an audience of people who perhaps are not other academics, not other students and so on, but are people in the field. It might be people who commissioned you to the research, it might be people working in the organisation where you're doing the work, who are interested in your results. So it's a much more of I wouldn't say lay audience, because it can be a professional audience, it can be other professionals like yourself, but it's lay in the sense of not being a kind of academic research methods kind of a group of people. It's different from that. And I'll talk more about that in a moment as well. But there are lots of other things. You can have oral reports, you know, either just simply talking to people about what you've done, and sometimes that's not a bad idea as well, to give a presentation on it. Of course, if you go to a conference, you do the same. You know, simple handouts, briefer kind of summaries of research can be written as well. Posters. Do you know about the conference ideas, about going to conferences? Have you any of you been to academic or professional conferences? One or two of you, okay, one or two nods there. Let me explain. I mean, the academic conference or the professional conference, very similar kinds of things. Very large affairs. They're normally a few hundred people to several thousand people. The ones in the States are quite enormous, thousands of people, but ones in this country tend to be more in the hundreds. So quite a large gathering of people. And they normally consist, they normally last 1, 2, 3 days. And they consist of a large number of people doing papers, doing presentations. Sometimes there'll be plenary sessions, so there'll be one session only, everyone going to the single session, some famous speaker, perhaps an invited person talking about their work, maybe for an hour. But there'll also be parallel sessions too, where there'll be lots of people, you know, like myself and perhaps other students like yourself doing papers based on their own research. Two smaller audiences. I mean, if you're lucky, you have, you know, a dozen people turn up. If you're unlucky, you have 1 or 2 people turn up. It's all a bit of a potluck who turns up to these parallel sessions, but a variety of things going on. Alongside that, you often have things called poster sessions. And this is for work in progress, so to speak. So, you know, you can imagine that giving a paper, reading a paper out, and normally those paper sessions last 20 minutes, half an hour, that kind of period of time. Reading out paper is often based on what you've done, so you've finished the work and you're reporting on it. But if it's work in progress, then you often do a poster, which means you produce a piece of, I don't know, A2 paper, and on there you can put all the details about your work. You can have diagrams and pictures and images along with text and so on. Some people go to great lengths to have nice coloured designs and so on, and they use PowerPoint and other things to design them. And then you have what's called a poster session, where everyone who's produced a poster stands alongside their poster while all the other people in the conference come round and look at them and chat to you about what you're doing. And of course that's a really good way of finding out who else is working in a similar area as they're doing the work. So it's a good way of exchanging ideas and information about things. So that's what I mean about the poster thing. That's a common feature of academic and professional conferences, where people are doing various kinds of work and wanting to report what they're actually doing at the moment before they finished it. Of course, you can produce pamphlets alongside leaflets and so on, which can be handed out to the public or handed out to people in the setting you've been working. And finally, there's things like the press release, the actual newspaper report, and there's a particular style of doing that. I'm not going to go into great detail now about how to write press reports. What I can advise you is that there are books on how to do press reports, and it's not a bad idea, if you're going to have to do one, either to talk to somebody who knows how to do it or to read up how to do a press report. It's a very different kind of approach from any other kind of writing you'd have done. So it's important to know how to do it properly. Okay, let me come back to some more detail of some of those points now. There are other ways of producing reports, alternative literary presentations. I'd beware of these. I mean, it's interesting to read them, but I think when you're starting out in any kind of research or any kind of professional career, stick with the standard normal things. If you're experienced, if you're well known and famous, then you can start to get into things like adversarial approaches, dialogue approaches and so on. You sometimes see these published in the journals. Rather than the dry academic tome that you tend to read in a journal article, this might be done as a kind of dialogue, two sides of an argument talking to each other and so on. Well, you've got to be very good to get away with that, so beware, but it is possible. Projects require more than one type of report. I mean, typically projects will have some kind of academic report, perhaps academic papers. They will have some kind of final report as well to the funders, and perhaps other kinds of outputs in terms of media reports and so on. Above all, bear in mind this: spelling, grammar, layout, design, reproduction, binding. The quality of things is very important. I mean, journals, of course, you have to follow the rules, and you'll get picked up on all kinds of things by the editors when you publish there. But even for things like reports to funders or the final reports of a funded project, you need to make sure it's done properly, that it's laid out well, that it looks good and so on. Most of those points apply to a dissertation as well, so make sure your dissertation is in good English and properly spelled and is neat, and the diagrams are properly labelled and the tables have got proper headings on and things like that. All those things that are really dull and boring, but they matter enormously in people's perception of what your work is like. If your reports are rather scrappy, people will judge your research as being scrappy, even if it isn't, even if it's very good research, but just poorly represented. If it's done in a bad font, I mean, don't use Comic Sans as a font in your research. It will just give the wrong impression altogether of the seriousness of the content. So bear that in mind as you produce your reports. It's not just the content; it's how you present it that matters as well. Sorry, I forgot I had this one in here. A little bit about ethics. This is, I'll come back in more detail to the ethics later on, but just at this point I want to mention again, I guess the point I made earlier on about the ethics of publication, that in a sense publication is part of the bargain of doing research. I will use up your time, but I'll put something back into society as a result. So I think the first thing is it's legitimate to publish, to expect publication from what's going on. Now, publication can be a variety of things. It can be very limited publication, just within the organisation, for example, or it can be very broad, in the mass media, and anywhere in between that as well is publication. you need to keep up your assurances of anonymity. So if you've done that in your informed consent form, and you can see on the form there's an area where it talks about anonymity and confidentiality. If you've given assurances about that, you need to make sure that when you publish things, you respect that. So you anonymise names and so on. Sometimes that can be quite difficult. It's not just the names that have to be changed, it's sometimes the context as well. Sometimes, you know, the kind of place people are working in and the kind of size it is and who else is there and what gender they are and so on. All of that gives away exactly who it is. So you have to be very careful how you anonymise. It's not just simply changing their names, it's other things that you might have to do to stop people finding out exactly who's involved. Oh yes, point number 3, probably something you won't come across for a while yet, but it is one of the issues with working in organisations. I mean, in my experience, the health service is one of those organisations where this happens, that they want to kind of control the kinds of reports that you produce, the kinds of outputs that come from it. I mean, even have a kind of veto over things. And if possible, bearing that in mind, be aware of that and try and avoid giving a veto to the organisations you're working with. You can't always do that. Even so, don't forget to bear in mind the legitimate interests of your sponsors, gatekeepers, but try not to allow them that censorship role if you can. Okay, so let's now look at one or two particular types of academic output. And this is one that you'll, I hope, be familiar with, the academic or the scientific journal. The kind of things you find, here's an example of a journal, International Social Science Journal, special issue on poverty, and there'll be a whole set of articles in there, and they'll all take this standard format, which I hope you're familiar with now. So, and we'll have a look at some of these later on in the exercise. So they all follow the same format. Each journal has its own format, so if you ever start writing for journals, bear that in mind, whether that's an academic journal or a professional journal. You need to look at how they do things in that journal and then follow that format, because they are slightly different. But they all have a title, they'll probably have an abstract, and the abstract is a short section of text that tells you everything in the article. And I have to say, one of the bees in my bonnet is about how bad everyone is at writing abstracts. And the main danger is that people write an abstract as if it were an introduction. No, an abstract is about everything. And that means it's about the content of the thing, it's about the data that was collected, the methods used, it was about the results you got, it's about the conclusions you're drawing from it as well. So it's not just a starting point, it's everything. But it's only in 100, 200 words. And the idea is to give a reader a quick idea of what's in that article, very quickly, so you can skim through it. The title is the first point of entry. The title has to tell you, first of all, what it's about, because that, in many cases, that's all people will look at, the title. They'll say, that's interesting, I wonder what that's about. And then they'll look at the abstract to get more detail, and they'll say, okay, do I need to read further or not? So all the time people make a decision about whether or not to read more. So the job that the title and then the abstract are doing is telling people in slightly more detail of what the whole paper's about, so that you can then get an idea about whether you want to read on further. Because as you all know, reading journal articles is not always easy. A standard social science 5,000, 6,000 word article takes a long time to read, and they aren't easy reading. So if you're going to put the effort in, you need to know it's worthwhile, and the title and the abstract are doing that job of giving you a quick way into the content. Then the article starts. Normally some kind of introduction. There will be some kind of scene setting, why this is an important piece of research to do, something of that kind. And then it'll move on to some kind of, well, either as part of the introduction, there'll be a lit review. Somewhere or the other, there's usually some kind of literature review. So a review of what we currently know in this area. And often it follows the introductory section before anything else. Then there's a methods section. Sometimes it's explicit. Again, the journals differ here. Some have a particular section called methods, and it has a certain layout and so on, maybe in a different font. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it's hidden in other ways, but there's normally some discussion of method. So all the things we've been talking about in this module are what comes in there, where you explain what you did and why you made those choices and so on about it. Then there's the results section. Then somewhere you talk about what you found. And this might be, tables if it's numeric and quantitative, and it might be numbers and tests and p-values and so on and so forth. Or it might be much more narrative because it's a qualitative piece of research and you're giving quotations from people about what they said and so on. But you're presenting your results. You may mix in with that some analysis as well, some discussion of what's going on. It depends, it's up to you and it's up to the journal actually. Some journals have different ideas about this, but check with the journal. But some of them will mix it together with the presentation results. Some will have a different section for discussion of results. So it depends how you want to do that. And then there's some kind of conclusion usually. So what does this all mean? And that can be part of the discussion as well, or it can be a separate conclusion section. Again, depends how you want to do it. But the conclusion is saying essentially, this is what we have found, this is how it's relevant to our knowledge, this is how we've moved our knowledge on from where we started back in the literary review. Or we haven't if we haven't found much, something of that along those lines. There's always a bibliography, and the bibliography is just those papers and journal articles that are being quoted in the paper itself. It's not a reading list, it's not a list of things that the author's read, it's a list of the things only that they have quoted in the paper, nothing else. So the standard way you might do that in an essay. So that's your journal article, and as I say, these are things you're familiar with, but the rationale for them I think is probably now becoming clearer. One or two other points about that journal format. The language itself, traditionally it's a very kind of formal kind of language, normally in the impersonal voice, and it's normally in the past tense. So you're talking about how things were done. The following results were obtained from an experiment examining so on. So it's in the past tense and that's that kind of formal language, often impersonal language. I've given an example here. A sample of 10 responses was taken and each was given the same test. So notice the passive voice, past tense here. That is changing now. Some journals are allowing a much more kind of active and maybe even personalised kind of writing. We used 10 respondents and they all took the same attitude test. Still past tense, but it's much more an active voice. Beware how you do that. Some journals like it, some journals don't. So don't push the boundaries when you're starting out. Check with what they want and what it's like. Again, it depends on the kind of journal. Some of the professional magazines would definitely want the second kind of approach. A short report on my work for a social work magazine would be kind of an active voice, and that'd be fine. But if it's a straightforward, top-ranking academic journal, then just follow whatever they do, and it will almost certainly be the more of the first kind of approach to the voice you're using. So it is changing, but not that fast. Okay, the second kind of output you might be involved with is a technical report. And I suspect probably that's the one that most of you will come across and most of you may actually get involved in writing in your careers to come. So when you're doing your work and you're back to your jobs and your various kinds of professional contexts, you'll be doing some various kinds of work. The result of what you do will be some kind of technical report. You may not be thinking of publishing in academic journals, but you'll need to write up in some way what you've done to disseminate it to others who are interested. And that's what the technical report is doing. It's not a journal format, but it is meant for an audience, often of other similar interested people. Not necessarily a completely lay audience. There may be technical expertise amongst them. There'll certainly be a kind of professional and intellectual kind of interest in what you've done in that audience. One thing to do here is to ask the sponsors or ask the people who are paying for your research what kind of report they want. Have they got examples of other things? And use examples of other reports to see how they've done it. So pick up reports from government and from organisations and so on and see how they've done it and see whether that's acceptable to your sponsors. And then write up in that format. One or two key differences here from the academic article. The first one is the executive summary. Normally reports have an executive summary in them. I mean, jokingly, it's often said executives don't have time to read, so they just want a short one page, because that's all they'll ever read. But actually, it's a way of starting the discussion of things. It's a bit like an abstract in that sense. It's brief, slightly longer than abstracts. Usually executive summaries are about a page in length, so more words than an abstract. And they do more things. In particular, although actually an executive summary normally covers everything in the report, so all the various details are there in summary form, but they focus less on the methods. They might just simply say a survey was done and that's it. If you want more detail, you look elsewhere in the report. But the executive summary focuses much, much more on the outcomes, conclusions and recommendations of the report. So an abstract wouldn't say so much about those things, pro rata, whereas an executive summary does. So the executive summary covers partly what you've done, how you found out and where you did it and so on. But in particular, it focuses on the conclusions and the recommendations. In other words, what should be done about what you found and so on. There should be stuff on methods still somewhere in the report, but usually that's put into some kind of appendix. So most people reading reports are not interested in the details of how you did it, but one or two of them will be. There'll always be somebody reading it who'll have done a course like this and know what they're talking about and think, have they done so and so? Did they do a pilot study? How have they drawn their sample? Was it properly representative and so on? They'll want to know the answers, so put that in an appendix. So that's not normally how you do it in a journal article, but in a report you can do that. And of course, present professional standards. Again, there's no excuse for not having it laid out properly spelt and proof checked and so on, properly numbered, etc. So all those kind of things. Nice diagrams. Use colour if you can afford it, or if your sponsors want it in colour. All those kind of things. So it looks really nice. Bind it properly. Have a good cover on it, etc. All of these things matter to impress the sponsors when you produce the report. And again, I suspect you'll come across these things as you work. You'll have reports to read, and you'll see the kind of formats that are adopted here. Right, revising the draft. This is the handout I've got for you now. Robson, again, from his first edition. The important point here is any kind of writing, and of course I'm sure you're aware of this for writing essays, but certainly I guess it's one of the habits that we get into in undergraduate degrees. I mean, I certainly know I did this at undergraduate level. Essays were things you wrote once only. You took a few notes, you wrote down some things, you had some books and with little stick-it notes in and so on, and then you came to write it, and you've done the same, have you? You sit down one evening, I've got 3 hours, I'm going to write it, and that's it, once only. It gets written, and then of course the deadline comes, you hand it in. And we've all done that at some point, and some of us done it more than others. When you get to postgraduate level and beyond, writing reports or research and so on, you have to get into the area of redrafting and rewriting. Nobody can produce good quality work straight off, and it needs to be good quality, so you do it again and again. You write drafts, you redraft, you restructure and so on, and you have to get used to doing that. So what I've got here is a handout, which I'm not going to go through in detail, but some good advice about revising a draft. The first point about this is give yourself time to do this. I mean, you can't do this the night before the deadline comes. So you need to have time, you need to give time to writing and to rewriting things, so you've got time to do it. And get the feedback you need. Feedback comes from yourself, asking yourself these kinds of questions as you read things, and these are a really good set of questions, I think. I mean, there's good reason why Colin Robson chose them for his book and borrowed them from Hartley. So the first port of call is your own view of things, so your own rereading of things, and often it helps to leave a slight gap of time, a week or so, maybe longer, between writing and rereading it. Because by that time you've forgotten exactly what you were saying, and it becomes clearer when you're not clear in your own writing because you've forgotten what you meant. And if you can't understand it, nobody else will be able to. So it gives you that kind of fresh kind of sight, if you like, or fresh understanding, or rather fresh misunderstanding of what's going on. But of course it helps to give it to other people too. So when you're doing dissertation work or PhD work, you've got a supervisor, give it to them and they will look at it and give you feedback on it. Other people, colleagues can be involved in it, other PhD students if you're doing a PhD, other colleagues at work if you're doing a report at work and having to write it up, get them to read your drafts and give you comments on it. And it often helps if you do that to tell them what kind of feedback you want. So if all you want is a proofread, tell them that. Just make sure I've everything's properly spelled and punctuated and so on. Just do that. Or if you want detail about the actual content, then tell them, I'm not sure whether this section makes sense here. Should I put it earlier or later? Or should I talk about this in greater length? In that case, much more focused kind of questions. It helps enormously when somebody else is reading it to know that's what you want as a way of feedback. And then all kind of other things I mentioned on here about ways of revising the text in various ways. Often, and one of the things, there's lots written on this, but one of the things that you often find with writing is that you kind of start writing in a rather kind of rambling fashion before you kind of get going. And the beginnings of paragraphs are often like that. When you come back and reread it, one thing you can often do is actually cross out one or two sentences at the beginning of the paragraphs. And the rest of it just works quite well on its own. You don't need the first bit. It's as if you kind of get warmed up. It's almost like the car has got to get going. Once it's going, then you're steaming along. Sorry about mixed metaphors there, but you're steaming along, writing fine. And the beginning bit's really just to get you going, and you can cross those out. So bear that in mind. Sometimes crossing things out and throwing it away is actually a good way of revising the text and getting it more focused and more compact in that sense. Okay, so just the general points, revising the draft is a very important thing to do, whether that's for dissertation work or for reports in organisations and so on.